it's played an important role in terms of identifying things like how smoking interacts with radon, how long since your last exposure, does it take for your risk to get down to zero. So what is Fluorspar? It's actually pretty cool. Like, I've been out to the area in Newfoundland, the St. Lawrence area where they do the mining. And when you're driving up the roads, they actually look a little greenish. And I don't know if it's because of some of the soil, the fluorspar that gets somehow incorporated into all that, but it's a really neat part of the country. But fluorspar gets used for a lot of different processes. Used in the production of aluminum, steel, lithium batteries. So it has a number of important uses, even in terms of creating lenses for microscopes and telescopes. And you'll see a picture here. It has this really rich green tint to it, although I think there are different sort of shades of color as well with fluorspar. So you'll see on the map here a picture of Newfoundland. The red dot is kind of like a really crude, identification of where Burin and St. Lawrence is in Newfoundland. It's about a 4-hour drive or so from St. John's. You feel like you're literally in the middle of nowhere. It's close to Marystown, which has like a really big shipyard. But it's home to one of the largest deposits of fluorspar in North America. There's a long history. It was first identified, gosh, it's almost 200 years now. So 1843. The mining of fluorspar in Newfoundland began in 1928. So a lot of the cohort that I'm going to be talking to you about are actually data that start, from 1930 onwards. And we're able to follow them up for 85 years. So it's a really long history follow-up period. So here's, I guess, my first poll question. So this question is asking, who was Canada's Prime Minister when an excess of lung cancer was first observed in St. Lawrence? So your choices are William Mackenzie King, Louis Saint Laurent, John Diefenbaker, or Lester B. Pearson. Lester B. Pearson was actually a chancellor at Carleton University, for those of you who didn't know that. But anyways, so I'm supposed to give about a minute or so, right, Colleen, for this poll? Okay.
About 15 more seconds. 70%
of the people have responded.
Okay.
Tell you're from Ottawa, question can
Well, what's even worse is I was walking around Mackenzie King Estate 2 weeks ago in the Gatineaus. If any of you go to Ottawa, go over to the Gatineaus, especially like this time of year when the leaves start changing, and they have William Mackenzie King's estate. You can just walk around. It's really cool.
So you have a little bit of a tie there.
We have a tie.
No clear winner.
Okay. So can we, I can end the poll. I guess I have to click on the X, right?
Just the X. Yeah,
Okay. Well, we have a tie and we don't have a tie. I see 31% for Louis Saint Laurent, which is actually the right answer. So, as the story goes, a local physician in the Burin area, Cyril Walsh, first identified some excesses of lung cancer right around 1956. So anyway, so it was Louis Saint Laurent. Okay. And for those of you who are interested, here's sort of a timeline of what's gone on in fluorspar mining in St. Lawrence. The text might be a little bit small to follow, but I think what's important to note is, like in the 1920s, there's this huge sort of tidal wave tsunami in Newfoundland, and it really created a lot of economic hardship. So the residents were looking for things to do other than things like fishing and that. So this time when the mine first opened coincided shortly after that. And when they hit World War II, there was a tremendous demand for Fluorspar. So a lot of people ended up moving into the area. And actually in this cohort, it's interesting because you could see there were like several workers who were just employed for about 6 months and then they kind of left. And then the mine kept going till about 1978, and because there was mining operations going on around the world and costs came down for producing it, essentially it just wasn't viable anymore. So the mine shut down in 1978, and it was shut down for a while, and there's been sort of recent attempts to restart it over the last few years. Okay. So some other historical notes. It wasn't just one mine. There was actually a series of mines in the Burin Peninsula. And in 1948, so I guess this was well before Newfoundland joined Canada, Newfoundland actually ranked 5th in the world in terms of production of world fluorspar. And as I mentioned, the mine closed in 1978. And since that time, there's been some increased opportunities to do shipping nearby. And I think that's around Marystown. So there is an initiative, they just got funding to sort of restart the mine over the next little bit. And for those of you who are interested, there's actually been a series of books sort of written about these miners. The Dying Hard book, and then the book called The Wake by Lyndon McIntyre. So both really interesting reads. Okay, so I'll actually start talking about the epidemiology now. So we have a cohort of about 200 or 2,100 underground miners and 550 surface miners. So as I mentioned before, the radon sort of accumulates underground in enclosed areas. So when we sort of, refer to the surface miners, those tend to be the people that, for all intents and purposes, we consider unexposed to radon. What happened in 1960, and again, thinking back to the local physician, Cyril Walsh, and him noticing an increase of lung cancers, they began to sort of look at the mines, and they found that there were really high levels of radon in the mines. And they introduced ventilation into the mines, and the exposure just went way, way down. So this is a situation where you have very high exposures pre-1960 and then much lower exposures after 1960. So when we think of a risk assessment, I guess value, the ones that are starting to work after 1960, their exposure would be more similar to what we'd sort of get in our homes. So that's one of the reasons why continuing to follow up these miners becomes important. And to show you how high these exposures were, the average cumulative exposure in these miners, we refer to it in terms of working level months. So over 5.5 years, the cumulative exposure working level months were 380. And the current guidelines are by the NIOSH CDC, exposure to radon progeny in underground mines shall not exceed 1 working level month per year. So you're talking about massive amounts of radon exposure. So this led to a series of epidemiological studies. So back then, it wasn't the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, it was the Atomic Energy Control Board, it was Health and Welfare Canada. So they did a few things. So forgetting aside, the fact that, the working conditions were so bad and the detriments to the community and the miners especially, if you think of the contributions of this cohort in terms of understanding radon risk, we have about 85 years of follow-up now, very high exposures. We have exposures post-1960, so we can look at risks at much lower levels. It's been really important in terms of bringing it into some of these other international efforts to understand risks of radon. It's one of the few cohorts that collected cigarette smoking data. So we have that for about half of the cohort. So that becomes important, understanding the relationship between smoking and radon. And I guess one of the other advantages of the Newfoundland fluorspar miners, I think I mentioned it in a later slide, but I'll mention it now, is that the source of the exposure of radon actually came from the water that was running underground the mines, and it came up. And unlike some of the other cohorts of, say, uranium miners, where they're exposed to other forms of radiation like gamma radiation, in this cohort, you don't have those other types of radiation exposures to deal with. It's just radon. A lot of radon, but it's radon. So this is a study that came out by one of my first co-op supervisors at Health Canada, Howard Morrison. So this is a study published in 1988 in American Journal of Epidemiology. And a lot of this analysis was based on external cohort comparisons, comparing the lung cancer mortality in these miners to Newfoundland men. Clear dose response pattern. You'll see the standardized mortality ratio for lung cancers, like 5-fold that to the general population. Clear dose response pattern. But one of the challenges is you only had 113 lung cancers. So statistically, it becomes really challenging. So after that point in time, there was more of a movement to doing internal cohort comparison. Poisson regression programs were being developed. There was a nice software program called Epicure that was developed that could do internal cohort Poisson regression modeling. So we ended up doing more analysis after that used these internal cohort comparisons. We also did smoking surveys, and that's an interesting story in itself, interacting with people in the community and getting smoking surveys run to track down these former miners. But we were able to collect smoking information for about half of the cohort. And what these studies tried to do is better assess how the risk of lung cancer in relation to radon exposure changed by things like attained age, smoking status, age at first exposure, those types of things. And then the other one was really important, dose rate. It's kind of like if you have the same overall cumulative exposure, is it more harmful to get small levels of exposure spread out over a longer period of time? Or is it more harmful to get the very high levels of exposure over a shorter time? And we actually found that it's worse to get the smaller doses over a longer period of time. So the other thing that we did too is around that time, there was some preliminary evidence coming out of the atomic bomb survivors showing that radiation might increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. So we added that to our list of things to look at. So some of the key findings we found was that this SMR, the external comparison, tended to be decreasing over time, which we kind of expected a little bit. And then things in terms of the internal cohort, we found that this excess relative risk per working level month tended to decrease as the attained age of these miners got older. I already mentioned we found some evidence of an inverse dose response. Our first paper on cardiovascular mortality, we found a suggestive increase of cardiovascular mortality with increasing radon exposure, but it wasn't statistically significant. And we had a really challenging time to distinguish how smoking interacts with radon. And a lot of that was a function of the fact that we had relatively few lung cancers. So when you start to look at effects of age, of smoking, and you're sort of really splitting the data finally. Okay, so here's time for poll question number 2. So in our 1997 paper, we estimated the attributable fraction of lung cancer due to radon. This estimate was 12, 42, 69, or 88%. So again, how many of the lung cancers do you think were caused by radon exposure in these miners? It's like watching a horse race at the casino. You know when you have those plastic horses going around?
3 more percent. There we go.
Okay, we all good?
Sharing results. There you go.
Yeah, you guys are good. It's like, yeah, 69%, which is incredible when you think of it, right? Like, my earlier slide that showed about 10% of lung cancers in Canada that were due to radon, and here in this cohort, this is close to 70%. We actually didn't do this estimate for our most recent paper, and maybe we should actually. Okay. Okay, so here is some of the results from our paper. I'm just trying to think what this one was. So this is our, I think our 2007 paper. So here, if you look at the excess relative risks, you can see that, with attained age, you see this really steep decrease as individuals sort of get older. So when you think of attained age in a Poisson regression, it's kind of, the risk as you're following them through, and every year of follow-up, their attained age gets a little older till they're censored or leave. The other thing I find really interesting is this time since last exposure. And this gets really helpful to understanding, how quickly the risk dissipates since you've last been exposed. We didn't find any effect at age at first exposure. There's been a few cohorts that have done that or found effects at age at first exposure with stronger associations in the younger ages. And the one that comes to mind is a cohort of Chinese tin miners. And what's remarkable about the Chinese tin miners, you actually have boys who are 12 years old who are included in that cohort. So that might be part of the reason why. Most of the men in this cohort would have been at least 18 years of age when they were first employed. Okay, so that was our finding from the 2007 paper. And that included mortality follow-up to the end of 2000. So you're asking, well, why do we need another study? You've already published it 3 times. Again, I think a lot of it relates to the fact that it's a relatively underpowered study because very few lung cancer deaths. And one of the key things from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's point of view, who funded this study, is that they really wanted to understand, well, in those miners that started after 1960 and the risks were really, or the exposures were much lower, are we seeing any kind of increased risk in that? So we were actually able to increase the follow-up of the cohort by another 16 years or so. The other thing that we were able to do, or we tried to do without a lot of success, is that with some of the more recent cancer incidence data, we can actually look at different types of lung cancers. So we can do analysis by, for adenocarcinomas or squamous cell carcinoma and things like that. So we tried to do some of that as well. The other thing that we thought is by doing this, we could create a nice data set that we might be able to pass over to some of the people doing the international work and have this data incorporated into some pooled analysis. And those discussions are still ongoing, and we hope that we can sort of get some of these data at the door from the StatsCan RDC to do that. So again, our research objectives were pretty much the same. We wanted to sort of look at how the risk of radon and lung cancer changed by things like attained age, smoking status, and I'll show you some of the models that we used to do some of that. And then we wanted to do another analysis of cardiovascular mortality because we did find a bit of an increased risk, but you'll recall it wasn't statistically significant. So we did the linkage with Statistics Canada. We were able to draw on the past occupational cohort, some of the information we had from the smoking surveys. We actually did smoking surveys in 66, 78, 93, and 2001. And we, saved information about where these people lived. So that allowed us to help do the linkage. One of the nice things when you're manually resolving links between occupational cohorts and mortality in Stats Canada is with this cohort in particular, like the people who were employed as miners tended to be from the area. So it makes it a lot easier to identify links with confidence. So the other thing that we did was we excluded some miners who were born before 1910 that we couldn't find in the registry because there was no death. We assumed they were lost to follow. So we have a sample size that's still just over 2,000 or so miners. To give you some information about how exposures were calculated, most of you are hygienists in here or training to be so. So this really is a good sort of demonstration about how exposure ascertainment can change over follow-up. So in the early part of, the cohort, you can imagine people weren't sort of measuring radon in the mines in 1933, right? So what they did was they took measures sort of later on around 1960, and they knew what the mine architecture was, the working conditions, so they tried to estimate exposures in different parts of the mines. And what they did was they knew where these miners would work, which mine, what their job duty was, and they assigned an annual measure of exposure to each of these miners on a year-by-year basis. In 1961 onward, this was after the ventilation had been introduced, and they took greater pains to sort of measure the exposure. So we have a little bit better characterization of exposure then. And from 1968 onward, they really measured exposure at an individual level basis. So again, you're going from exposure assessment that's really crude before 1960 to a little bit better, and then you're finally getting into personal monitoring. So this slide just talks a little bit about working level months. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, when we're talking about working level months, it's sort of assuming a 40-hour work week, being exposed to one working level. That's one working level month. And then if you want the conversion between becquerels and working levels, it's there for you as well too. So this slide shows, so this is using the most recent data that we have, how much the exposures sort of went down over time. And when the mines first opened, a lot of the mining was surface mining, so people wouldn't have been exposed to higher levels of radon. And you'll see that, if you get into like the 1940s to like 1960, you're dealing with very, very high levels of exposure. And then you see once you hit, when ventilation was introduced, the exposure just become fairly flat after that. Well, at least flat relative to the high exposures received before. So this is a little bit of a description of the cohort characteristics of the most present study. You will see everything is rounded off to 5 because Stats Canada has made me promise that's how I'll present the numbers. There's 315 surface miners, 1,735 underground miners. So at the end of the most recent fall, at the end of 2016, there's still 690 miners who are considered still alive because we didn't find them in the record linkage. This will probably be the last update of this cohort. So now we're up to 235 lung cancer deaths. So you're still dealing with a relatively small number of lung cancer deaths. And we have smoking data for about half of the cohort. 85% of the miners smoked at some point in time. And again, you're dealing sort of with historical data a lot too. So the smoking prevalence would have been a lot higher back then. So anyways, this is the most recent SMR analysis. And you'll see here the key thing that you'll find is, where is it? The SMR for trachea, bronchus, and lung is now down to 2.67. So again, these miners had like 2.7 times higher the risk of lung cancer mortality compared to Newfoundland males. And again, this is a function as you increase the follow-up of these occupational cohorts, the SMR tends to decrease over time. You'll also see the reduced risk for circulatory cardiovascular disease. You have SMRs of about 0.8, 0.85, and you'll probably be familiar with the healthy worker effect, and I think that's really a function of what's going on there. For those of you who like stats and want to do Poisson regression, this is sort of the functional form of the types of model that we fit. So it's sort of like an excess relative risk. So that's why you see that relative risk is a function of 1 plus beta times some level of exposure. And what we end up doing is we fit those models and then we fit them across different strata. We test for heterogeneity, and then we can make a conclusion about whether the effects differ across things like attained age, categories of time since last exposure, or so on. One of the neat things about the analysis here is they do this time windows analysis. So what that means is they'll take your total exposure to radon over your working history, and they'll say, well, what portion of that happened like more than 20 years ago? What portion of that happened 10 to 20 years ago? What portions? So you'll see in the bottom of here is that we'll actually partition the exposure into these different time windows. And that Beer 6 report that I mentioned to you, that's kind of how they estimate risk of lung cancer from radon exposure. They look at what period the exposure occurred. So as we're creating our Poisson regression analysis and we're following up people and tabulating person years and exposure, it becomes a little challenging because you always have to sort of throw the exposure into the different bucket to make sure you can look at it. So it's actually fun programming when it works at the end, but it sometimes takes a while to get there. So this is the updated analysis of lung cancer and radon exposure with the 2016 follow-up. You'll still see if you get into the highest categories of exposure, you're still getting relative risks of around 40. So again, like you're finding huge effects of huge risk of lung cancer due to radon exposure. At the very bottom of this slide, you'll see what the excess relative risk per 100 working level months is. It's about 0.41. So that slope is coming down with successive sort of analysis of these cohorts. And again, a lot of that is a function that the time since last exposure is increasing since previous analysis. Another thing that we did was we wanted to try to show how this excess relative risk would change as follow-up increases. And this kind of shows what I was referring to in the last slide. If you take the follow-up period from 1950 to 2016, so this is all the person years of follow-up, you'll see that the excess relative risk per working level month is a little bit lower than what we were getting in our earlier analysis of the cohort. So again, I think one of the key takeaway messages from this is that a summary excess relative risk per working level month isn't really a great way of depicting the risk in this cohort, because you got to look at things like time since exposure and attained age and things like that. And this basically goes through, and again, it's very similar to what we've done before, although we were able to, we had more lung cancer deaths in many of these cells. We had greater precision. We didn't find that there was an increased risk of lung cancer when we just looked at exposures post-1960. So that was reassuring to us and to the miners who started work after 1960, I'm sure too. And here's the analysis from the time since last exposure. So this is how it would be presented. So you can see that the risk clearly goes down with increasing time since they were exposed. Now, this is the really fun stuff, the smoking and lung cancer interaction. So we can actually look at this mixture model, and we can look at additive versus multiplicative and anything in between. And that's sort of where you see these sort of fancy Greek symbols there that you can test whether or not the lambda is equal to 1 for a multiplicative versus an additive model. Again, one of the limitations, we only had smoking for about 50% of the cohort. So, but here's some of the results that we were finding is that you are seeing sort of a slightly higher excess relative risk per working level a month among those who are smokers. Again, most of the miners in this cohort that we had smoking information were smokers. So we have a very small number of lung cancer deaths, only 10 in the never smoking category. So that limits analysis. And it also speaks to why there's value in sort of pooling some of these data across the cohorts. And you'll see here, this is sort of a way of presenting the risk for both smoking status and cumulative radon exposure. And you'll see if you go to the highest smoking category of 25 cigarettes smoked per day and more than 1,000 working level month, those people had about a 19 times higher risk of dying from lung cancer compared to those who, smoked less than 12 cigarettes a day and had less than 100. So it really shows how smoking and radon are impacting lung cancer risk in this cohort. So I'm almost done. How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay. I only got a few more slides. So the other thing that we looked at in this cohort was radon and cardiovascular mortality. And again, I mentioned to you that there's been some studies of the atomic bomb survivors cohort where they've found increased risk of ischemic heart disease. There's also been some findings of women treated for cancer with radiation having increased risk of heart disease. And mechanistically, there's some pathways where radiation can, promote the development of atherosclerosis. So these are sort of the different causes of death that we've looked at in the Newfoundland Fluorspar miners. So we looked at sort of all circulatory cardiovascular deaths combined. We looked at ischemic heart disease, acute myocardial infarction. We also looked at stroke, but there weren't as many cases. And so these are results from a paper that we just published last year. And we didn't seem to find any increased risk of cardiovascular mortality in score. You remember when we looked at this like 20 years ago or something like that, there was a hint of an increased risk of cardiovascular mortality, but it wasn't statistically significant. But here, if you sort of go to the upper categories, you'll see that for all circulatory disease deaths, after adjustment for things like smoking status, the relative risk was 1.006 in the highest cumulative radon exposure relative to those who weren't exposed. And then we didn't find anything statistically significant either for ischemic heart disease. So anyways, that's our results for cardiovascular disease. So to sort of summarize all this, so yeah, we've been at it, I've been fortunate enough to participate in this for like over 30 years now. That's crazy. But we've updated the risk several times. We've shown, how the SMR and excess relative risk change with increasing follow-up. We're not seeing any increased risk of lung cancer in relation to radon exposure among those who started after 1960. So I think that's sort of the most important piece out of our most recent analysis. We're really having challenges discriminating between models of radon, smoking, and lung cancer. You just need more than like 200 lung cancers to do that well. No association between heart disease and radon. The one thing I will add is some of the other cohorts have started to find links with radon and other types of cancer, stomach cancer, colon cancer. So I think sort of to close everything off with a nice bow in this cohort, we'll do some analysis to report on that too. But this really is the last update, I think, of this cohort. When you think that you have 85 years of follow-up, right? Like how much longer do you have to go? So, but that's it. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming to hear about it. Thanks.